great to have everyone here. We're going to get going. My name is Jim Saylor, and I am the Executive Director for the Center for Biomedical Research at the Population Council, which is the host of this event. And this is a terrific event. My fun job is to introduce this and introduce the speakers for this event. I noticed when looking at the attendees that even as fantastic as the speakers are, and they are fantastic, the people in the attendance of this are also a fantastic group as well. Many of you have spent decades involved in the microbicide movement and development, and we're just delighted to have all of you here. If I gave a full bio for every speaker, it would take the whole hour, so I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to just briefly introduce our speakers, go through a little bit of housekeeping, and then hand it off. Our first speaker is Barbara Friedland, who is at the Center for Biomedical Research at the Pop Council. And Barbara, if you've been in the microbicide world, you certainly know Barbara. She spent over 25 years at the Pop Council. She now leads our behavioral research effort at the Center for Biomedical Research. She will be speaking along with Diantha Pillay, who you see as Pop Council. Diantha is at IPM, the International Partnership for Microbicides, South Africa. Last year, as most of you will know, the Pop Council acquired the assets of IPM. That's a kind of a technical term in the nonprofit world, but what it really means is that we integrated the International Partnership for Microbicides and the DapiRing program into the Pop Council. So we're delighted to have Diantha, who's the Associate Director for Product Access, and she's based in our office in Cape Town, South Africa. I think all of you will know Chris Elias, who's the president of the Global Development Division at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Before that, he was the CEO of PATH for many years. But for all of us at the Pop Council, we just think of Chris as a Pop Council alum who was part of the Ebert program and a country director for the Population Council in the 1990s, among many other things he has done. Delighted to have you here as well, Chris. We have Sharon Hillier, who you all know. Sharon is a professor at the University of Pittsburgh Medical School. She was the principal investigator for the Microbicides Trial Network. She's now the director, the lead PI for the Matrix program, which is the USAID program that for the development of the ongoing USAID program for the development of HIV prevention products. And last but not least, we have Georgina Caswell. Georgina is the director of programs for the Global Network of People Living with HIV. She's based in Cape Town, South Africa. And Georgina was a board member of both, first the International Partnership for Microbicides. Now she's a board member of the Population Council. So that is our speaker group today. I'm going to move on to the housekeeping for today, and then we're going to get right into the talks. So if you can advance the slide one, thank you. You all should have gotten a warning that the webinar is being recorded. You will all be muted as participants just to make this go as smoothly as possible. And if we have time for Q&A at the end, I will lead the Q&A. And please feel free, after all the speakers have spoken, to put your questions and comments into the chat. With that said, I'll just say how delighted the Population Council is to be hosting this, how delighted we are to see you all here. Thank you for introducing yourselves as you've gotten on, and I'm now going to turn it over to Barbara and Diantha.
Thanks, Jim. So the impetus for this webinar actually happened back in November when I was at a meeting with our president, Julia Bunting, who unfortunately was unable to be here today because she is traveling to the US as we speak. And she was announcing the partnership with, or the transition to IPM merging with the Population Council. And I started talking about the history, and she said, we should do a webinar about this. And so that's where we are today, and that's the impetus. So Diantha and I are going to kind of talk through a brief history of the Population Council and IPM and our joint ventures together. And then we will hear from Chris Elias, who was very instrumental in getting the council involved in microbicides development in the early days. Sharon Hillier, who oversaw many microbicides trials, and Georgina will talk with us about the importance of advocacy. Next slide, please, Sherry. So just to give everybody a brief overview of the Population Council for those who may not be as familiar with the whole organization. The Population Council's strategic goals through 2030 are to ensure sexual and reproductive health and rights and choices, to empower adolescents and young people to reach their full potential, to achieve gender equality and equity, and to pursue justice in the face of climate and environmental changes. Next slide, please. So CBR is a nonprofit product development partnership within the Population Council, and our vision is to develop and make available products that enhance safety and choice. We focus on addressing unmet needs, enabling self-care, offering different and better side effect profile, and expanding the options for multi-purpose prevention. And we do it with partnerships, starting with product development through clinical evaluation, regulatory approvals, marketing, and licensing. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot showing all of the products that the council has developed and brought to market. And you'll notice the last two are both intravaginal rings. We have the Annovera, which is the 1-year contraceptive vaginal ring, and now the DapiRing vaginal ring, which is the 1-month ring. Next slide, please. So I have to say, it was very difficult for me to put together this kind of history slide because there is so much to say. So I'm just going to try to briefly summarize kind of the last 30 years. And basically, the Population Council was working both in terms of developing our own products over the past 30 years, as well as advocating for microbicides writ large. So we started work on HIV transmission basic science research back in 1986. These are just a few milestones here. And in 1996 was when we first discovered that carrageenans block HIV in laboratory and animal studies. In 1993, Chris, Elias, and Lori Heisey, who I noticed Lori's also on this webinar, this is fantastic, published The Development of Microbicides, a new method of HIV prevention for women. And that's when, as Jim mentioned, Chris was part of the Ebert program on critical issues in reproductive health. Then another milestone was when the Population Council partnered with the Women's Health Advocates for Microbicides to hold a symposium on the practical and ethical dilemmas in microbicide testing. And if you all can try to think back to 1997, there was no treatment for HIV available in most of the world. AZT was being used, but triple therapy did not yet exist. And there were many practical and ethical dilemmas, literally, about how to find out if topical microbicides worked without increasing people's risk. So one of the big debates was, should condoms be promoted in microbicide trials? Another debate was, which populations should we be doing these studies in? Hard to believe it now, but another big debate was, people have to be tested to make sure that they're HIV negative to enroll in these trials, but do we tell them what their results are when there's nothing for them to do? So think back to those early days. And I would be remiss if I do not mention my two bosses at the time, Krista Coggins, and Liz McGrory, and of course, all working with Chris. We did a lot of research on end user and formulation preferences, a study looking at 3 different formulations of non-oxynol 9, which was the first thing to be tested to see if it could be a microbicide. And then we also did a series of phase 1 and 2 safety and acceptability trials of carrageenan gel formulations that led up to our phase 3 trial of Carragard. The Carragard trial was also a very big step in the council and the field's development, because we developed an informed consent video, which was for the Carragard trial, and then that led to the development of a video that was supported by IPM that could be used in multiple microbicide trials. We also developed a dye stain test to assess adherence. And at the time, there was a bit of an outcry of how can we not believe women's self-reports. And in the Carragard trial, about 96% of women said that they used the gel the last time they had sex, whereas according to the applicator test, it was more like 44%. And lo and behold, after the outcry from many people within and outside of the council, that's kind of like what was found in early PrEP trials too. So it's really, really tricky to do trials of an on-demand product, because you have to figure out when are people having sex and are they using the product when they're having sex. So we, unfortunately, the Carragard trial, as I think everybody knows, showed that the product was safe, but it was not effective for HIV prevention. However, carrageenan is very effective for HPV prevention and HSV, so we continue to use carrageenans in our other products. In 2012, we found that MIV-150, which is an antiretroviral in a ring, could prevent HIV transmission, and that was the first efficacy data on rings for HIV prevention. And then we have been doing ongoing research now with Gripicin, and we're working on a Gripicin carrageenan fast dissolving insert that prevents HIV, HSV2, and HPV in non-human primates. And in our first phase 1 gel study, the product was shown to be safe and had ex vivo efficacy. And then in 2022, Pop Council acquired IPM's portfolio of products and other assets, as Jim mentioned. And at this point, I will turn over to Diantha, just in time for my dog to be barking, who will take us through now to talk about IPM before merging with Pop Council and ongoing.
Thanks, Barbara. So IPM, the International Partnership for Microbicides, is a nonprofit product development partnership. It was founded back in 2002 with the mission to develop products for HIV prevention for women in order for them to protect themselves and their sexual and reproductive health. And in addition, it is to make these products available and also accessible to where it's most urgently needed. So to make this possible, DapiRing was licensed to IPM back in 2004 to develop as a microbicide for HIV prevention. And this then gave birth to the DapiRing vaginal ring, and now registered as the DapiRing. Next slide, please. So focusing just on some key milestones for the DapiRing. IPM, as we know, has commenced studies in the ring as early as 2004, and this was starting off with feasibility studies and then progressing on to clinical trials and then open label extension studies. So 2 randomized control trials, the RING study and the ASPIRE study, reported that the ring was approximately 30% effective in reducing HIV infection. Subsequently, we had open label extension studies, DREAM and HOPE, which showed an increase in efficacy as a result of an increase in adherence, and this was approximately around a 50% risk reduction. Now, following these positive phase 3 trial results, and looking at in July 2020, the ring received a positive scientific opinion from the European Medicines Agency, or the EMA, for use among cisgender women age 18 years and older to reduce the risk of HIV infection. Subsequent to this, the WHO in 2021 provided a recommendation on the use of the ring, and then further included the ring in their consolidated HIV guidelines. Next slide, please. So now, following this process, we had submitted applications to medicines regulators in Africa for in-country approval. And currently, as it stands, the ring is now approved in 9 countries. And in countries, for example, such as Lesotho and Eswatini, which do not have their own medicines regulators and are following the regulations of the South African medicines regulators. Then if we look at countries where we are planning submissions, those are Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Mozambique. We have submissions pending in Namibia and Botswana, and a submission under appeal in Tanzania. Next slide, please. Now, following the pathway to access, the next step after product registration is government buy-in and implementation studies. So I'm happy to show this map that currently shows that there are 15 planned implementation studies in Africa, and they're supported by a number of donors. So this includes the UNAIDS, the USAID, UNITAID, the Global Fund, and CIF. Expanding beyond the African continent, UNAIDS is also planning a feasibility study looking at the Asia-Pacific region, and this being in Cambodia, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, and Indonesia. Now I'm going to hand back to Barbara, who will take us through the product development pipeline.
Thanks, Diantha. So on the left, this is a very brief snapshot. On the left, you will see the DapiRing products. So we are developing a 3-month DapiRing ring, which is a line extension to the existing 1-month ring. And one of the key attributes is that it has the potential to reduce the annual cost by about 60%. We're also working on the development of a DapiRing contraceptive vaginal ring, which contains levonorgestrel, and that will be a 3-month ring. Then on the right side, you will see our Gripicin products. So as I mentioned before, we're developing a fast-dissolving vaginal or rectal insert for on-demand prevention of HIV, HSV, and HPV, as well as a Gripicin FDI for on-demand prevention of HIV and pregnancy. And last, a 90-day etonogestrel ethinyl estradiol Q-Gripicin IVR for pregnancy and HIV prevention. And most recently, we started developing a non-hormonal MPT IVR. It's a non-hormonal contraceptive MPT IVR containing copper, zinc, and lactide for pregnancy, STI prevention, and maintenance of vaginal health. So that is the brief overview. And I just wanted to give a shout out to our Sherry, if you could go to the last page, our multiple partners and funders of all of this work, which we could not possibly do without this large group of people. So thank you very much for your attention. And as Jim said, if there's time for questions, we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. And I'll just say that the pipeline, the products that Barbara just overviewed are, of course, not all the microbicides products in the universe, but merely the ones the Pop Council is working on. Now I'm going to I've already done the introduction. I'm just going to turn it over to Chris. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Barbara and Diantha. It's great to see. I must say I'm not up to date on all that you've been doing, so it was great to hear that summary. You know, for those I haven't met, and many of the people on the line can actually tell this story probably better than me. But you know, I worked for the Pop Council in the 90s, from 1990 to 2000. And last weekend I went back in my files. Barbara asked me if I had any slides, and I discovered I did have some slides. The problem was they were slides, and I actually had them in a carousel, but I had no projector, and I suspect you don't anymore either. It was a different era. And what I'm going to try and do in less than 10 minutes is summarize 10 years of my engagement with the council, with the support and partnership of many people who are on the phone. And to try and highlight what I think are some of the key moments in the awareness and evolution of the field. So, you know, as I was with the council for 10 years, 4 years in New York with the EBRT program and 6 years in Bangkok as the country director working in Southeast Asia. You know, I joined the EBRT program in the middle of 1990, you know, a visionary program that Judith Bruce and Beverly Winnicott put together on quote unquote critical issues in reproductive health. You have to remember this was 4 years before the Cairo Conference on International Population and Development. The idea of reproductive health was actually still somewhat controversial, right? That you had mostly organizations that had been very focused on family planning, fertility control, and there were, you know, some of the major funders at the time were actually reluctant to take a broader scope, worrying it was going to deflect interest. So I joined the EBRT program and in 1990 as the first person at the council whose full-time job was to think about STDs and HIV. It's hard to believe that 33 years later. And one of my first tasks was to think about what areas in the vast world of STD and HIV, and remember this was less than 10 years into the AIDS pandemic, what areas should the council get involved in? And you know, back then, I don't know if the council still does this, we used to publish these working papers. And the first one that I published was actually in 1991, and it was called Sexually Transmitted Diseases and the Reproductive Health of Women in Developing Countries. And it was really a review of the literature and a recommendation to the council of areas that had been underexplored that I thought the council should work on. One was the idea of how do you you know, the council was well known in those days for operational research on family planning. How could that operational research capacity of the foundation be applied to integrated reproductive health services, including services for the prevention and treatment of reproductive tract infections, including HIV and other STDs. The second was to actually do some research on all of the speculation about whether various contraceptives increased or protected against the risk of HIV, IUDs, Norplant, which was just registered in that era. There were questions, and they had been not really well researched. A third, which Lori Heisey, who's on the phone, and I spent a lot of time on, was understanding the social and behavioral context in which women experience vulnerability to STD and HIV and what some of the potential interventions would be. I remember Lori and I convened an initial meeting with NIH and others where some of the people who came said, well, women aren't really at risk of HIV. You know, 10 years in, the US experience was so much dominated by the IV drug users and men who have sex with men who dominated the epidemiology in the US in that first decade. But the fourth recommendation, it's actually in the final paragraph of this 1991 working paper, was to develop a female-controlled HIV prevention method, which we referred to in that paper as a viricide, quoting the pioneering work that Zena Stain at Columbia, who I think was the first person to really start publishing on this in the late 80s about the need for these products, and her work with Erica Golub, who I think is also on the line, on the women's condom, was sort of pioneering the idea that there was a need for prevention methods that were under the control of women, given the difficulties of insisting on condom use and avoiding riskier sex. So it was that 1991 paper that really laid out an agenda for the council's research on STDs and HIV and talked about viricides. And that's where, with George Brown and the late George Seidenstein, who was president of the council at the time, we started a conversation between the programs division where I worked and the Center for Biomedical Research, which to that point had been very successful in developing and registering new contraceptive methods. I think by 1990, the council had already registered 7 different contraceptives with the FDA, which is a nonprofit research institute. It's pretty amazing. And so, you know, we had this conversation. There was some initial interest, some skepticism about the feasibility of the work. somewhere in my papers, and they're literally on paper because there was no email then. There's documents of the back and forth, which Eisenstein as president finally convened with the board. I remember being a relatively young associate at the council, going with him to a Pop Council board meeting in order to seek the board's permission to expand the mandate of the council, which was clearly for contraceptive development, to look at developing HIV prevention, vaginal products for HIV prevention that might or might not be contraceptive. He felt like since it was new territory, he needed the board's endorsement. I do wonder if it was also his way of bringing the two parts of the council together in a more collaborative fashion. But whatever happened, that happened, right? And working with David Phillips at the CBR, who was a cell biologist who was doing pioneering work at the time on understanding cell entry mechanisms, and had started screening compounds. And the vision was, could we find a very affordable, non-specific compound that could prevent cell entry? And that's what led us to some of the sulfated polysaccharides. The critical working paper, I think, was the 1993 working paper that Lori and I put together, which is, I think, one of the thickest working papers that the council's ever put together. And the council would often use the working papers to get a discussion going. I mean, the paper, the working paper that Lori and I wrote, wound up as two peer-reviewed articles, one in the Journal of AIDS on some of the challenges of microbicides development in the early 90s, and a second paper, more important paper, that Lori was the first author of in Social Science and Medicine, understanding and describing the research at the time on women's vulnerability and the limitations of what some of the current HIV prevention methods approaches were at the time. That still is one of the most cited papers on women and HIV, even though it's now 30 years old. So that brought us to publish that paper, to start a number of convenings. And one of the important shifts that happened between 1991 and 93 was the shift from talking about virucides to talking about microbicides. And that was due to some collaboration and discussion we had with the International Women's Health Coalition, which at the time had convened a meeting in Bellagio, had put together a whole new effort on talking about reproductive tract infections, because in fact, many reproductive tract infections are not sexually transmitted, but cause similar symptoms and need reproductive health services. And I think actually Sharon did some of the most pioneering work on in that era. It still is doing it, I think, on bacterial vaginosis and other reproductive tract syndromes. So as we were drafting the paper, we were getting a lot of input from the women's health community to say, look, why just look for a viricide? Why not look for something that's broader spectrum that would address the broader range of women's vulnerabilities? So we shifted to using the term microbicide. We then also formed a very important collaboration that Barbara referred to with the women's health advocates for microbicides, because one of the things that we encountered once the council got into the microbicides field was a lot of skepticism from the women's health community, who had been skeptical of the history of contraceptive research and not taking enough perspectives from women, either in the design of products or in the design of trials. And so working together with the International Women's Health Coalition and a broad range of advocates, we started a regular set of consultations. In 1994, I moved from New York to Bangkok, and the late Charlotte Ellertson became the key New York-based focal person for that work. And I worked from Bangkok closely with Charlotte. We did a lot of the phase 1 and 2 trials in Thailand, which at the time in the mid-90s, one of the reasons we thought about that is that they had a very rapidly rising HIV rate. Fortunately for Thailand and many people, they got that, Thailand is held as one of the most successful national HIV programs. So by the time we got to phase 3, we couldn't power a study in Thailand. But we did some very important work. And one person I want to call out who's on the chat is Ganukwan Tarawan, or Gay, as many people knew her at the time, who worked with us, worked with the women's health advocates, worked with Krista and Liz and others, as we did some of those acceptability studies, looking at different formulations of microbicidal compounds to inform the product development work at CBR. So we then, started that program. We worked closely with the US CDC's field research site up in Chiang Rai, where we did a lot of that work. And a lot of it then you've heard from Barbara. I was last directly involved in microbicides development shortly in 2000 after I made the transition to PATH. I worked with the Rockefeller Foundation funded effort that George Brown led to look at whether we needed a more organized sectoral approach to microbicides development. And so my last direct involvement in microbicides was actually in some of the work that George led in forming the case for the creation of the International Partnership of Microbicides. And my good friend and collaborator, Zita Rosenberg, kind of took that and became the standard bearer, working closely with Sharon and others in the Microbicides Trials Network. And so really for the last 20 years, I've been more of a cheerleader than directly involved in microbicides, but I'm sure I left a lot of details out of that first decade. But I think I'll stop there. I think, Jim, I have to leave a few minutes early to go to an executive team. So, if there's questions, I'll stay as long as I can. So over to you, Jim.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. That was just an amazing to think about all that's been done and the amount of time we have and so on. So that was fantastic. In the interest of time, I'm going to turn it right over to Sharon. Sharon, good to see you, and over to you.
Yeah, nice to see you, and Chris, nice to see you as well. Listening to your history made me reflect on so much of our shared experiences, amazing journey that we've had. So I really appreciate Barbara's introduction, reminding us all that when this field started in 1995, there was somewhat of a disbelief that women were an important part of the HIV pandemic. There was no notion of women's reproductive health to a large extent. And there was, I think, quite a lot of fast and loose thinking about what could work. I remember I was invited to the first White House conference on HIV/AIDS, which was held in 1995 by President Clinton. And people were saying things like, well, why don't we just put bleach in the vagina? Why don't we just put disinfectants, phenolic compounds, Lysol and the like, because that would kill HIV. And I was a vaginal ecologist, thought a lot about the vaginal microbiome, and said, no, we can't treat the vagina like it's a dirty place to disinfect. We have to really think about these as reproductive health products. So, my own view is that one of the key directives of my own career is to find ways to make more options available to people who need to protect themselves from HIV. And more options will lead to better choices so that people who want protection can have protection. The availability of more choices will lead to greater coverage. And finally, that will lead to better impact. And so my entire career has been driven by that drive to identify options that can lead to better choices, which means you have to understand what people want, to ensure that they can make better coverage, which means you have to make things that are inexpensive and accessible to people, and then make sure that you actually have that impact. So in 2006, I was asked by the NIH to develop the Microbicide Trials Network. I've skipped a lot of history there, but the bottom line is a lot of the work that had been ongoing in the Clinical Trials Network and the HIV Prevention Trials Network was not IND work. And so it wasn't new drug development. And so Peggy Johnston, who was at the Division of AIDS at the time, approached me at a microbicides meeting in Antwerp, actually, and said, Sharon, would you think about pulling together the work in microbicides so that we can actually put all of that drug development IND work under a single clinical trials network? And so that's really how it happened. I sat down at my desk when we were funded at 2006 and wrote a little poem. It's quite cheesy, but it's been hanging over my desk for, well, about 18 years now. And I'm going to read it with you. It says, imagine there's a product. It's easy if you try. It would stop infection and be cheap to buy. Imagine all the people living HIV free. You may think I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I want you to join us because together we can work as one. I don't think I've ever shared that crazy poem with anybody before, but it was really our philosophy as we formed the Microbicide Trials Network to bring people together to actually develop a united cause, to develop in a very scientifically rigorous way microbicides for use in women. Now, over the course of the study of the MTN's life, we designed 45 studies, and we worked with Gilead, we worked with Merck, we worked with IPM, we worked with Pop Council, we worked with anyone who had a product that was moving forward, who could provide what we needed to actually test it. And both anyone having receptive sex. So we worked in people who have an anal receptive sex, and we worked with women who were having vaginal sex. So I went back and did a quick head count. We, I think, did 16 different trials of what are now Pop Council products, 16. And in the course of our network, we enrolled about 17,000 study participants, and about half of those were engaged in studies of the DapiRing ring or Griffithson or other ring formats that the Pop Council was working on. And when we thought about it, what we really wanted to do was not just do the efficacy studies, but all the bells and whistles that go around it. The pharmacokinetic studies, the bridging studies to adolescent, the bridging studies to pregnant women, a really overlooked group of people at high risk of HIV. We wanted to bridge into women who were lactating, and we wanted to bridge into women who desired contraception. So what did we work on? One of our first studies was MTN-005, which was a study of a placebo ring, because there was a lot of talk at the time. Oh, women will never use rings. They're too big, they're too clunky, they're too foreign. And we found women can use rings. We also studied the Griffithson product rectally as a gel, and that was in MTN-037. We did a whole range of products with DapiRing. We started with actually our first DapiRing protocol was with male partners. People, no matter what, always worry so much about whether or not guys' penises will get inflamed by having sex with a woman with something in her vagina. And our very first study with DapiRing was a DapiRing gel that was placed on the foreskin and penis of males to show that it was safe. So that was MTN-12. We did a study early on of the DapiRing and Maraviroc ring, because that was the thinking at the time, was that would be magnificent. That was a really important study to show us, teach us about the PK of these vaginally applied products. You've already heard about the Aspire study, which was 2,500 women, and it was one of the two studies that contributed to the licensure or the approval of the DapiRing or DapiRing as it's known now. We did a study in 15, 16, and 17-year-old US girls to show that it could be used, the DapiRing ring, in young adolescents successfully, that they liked it, and that it had an extremely good safety profile. We did the first and I think only study of a microbicide in postmenopausal women, and found that even though women who are older have greater vaginal dryness, that we saw good PK and safety, and it was still comfortable in that often overlooked group. We did the HOPE study, which was MTN-025, which was the open label extension of women who had been in the Aspire study. Then we looked at DapiRing gel as a rectal product in 026 and 033, showing that you can deliver drug rectally at the time of sex as a lube, but probably not enough to be effective. A study, and it may be my favorite MTN study, is the REACH trial, MTN-034, in which we actually, for the first time, engaged with young women and said, we're going to give you access to two products, oral Truvada and the DapiRing. And you'll use each for 6 months, and then you get to choose which one you like. And this was a really important opportunity for us to engage with young women where they live and to assess which one they wanted. This study is actually now in the final stages of manuscript development, but it was 250 women. We did the whole thing during the pandemic. It was terrible. It was a horrible time to do a study. But what we found is at the end of the trial, 2/3 of the young women chose the ring. They knew that on paper, oral Truvada is much better if you use it every day. But in women who actually had used it, they found that it's, and many women make the choice, I can use this product, and because I can use it, it's the better product for me. Really important. And I'd like to see more studies that happen like that. Finally, we did a 90-day ring study and found that the 90-day ring, DapiRing, had wonderful pharmacokinetics. That was MTN 036. We did 2 studies of the MPT 90-day ring. That was MTN 30 and 044. And then our final studies that are just getting completed now are the DapiRing ring and pregnancy study, MTN 042. It was just presented at CROI in February, showing that pregnant women can use safely the DapiRing and that it was highly acceptable. Also showed that in lactating women in MTN 043. So we've tried to fill in all the blanks because what we're trying to do is make sure that this product can be used by pregnant women, women who are very young, adolescent, women who are lactating. We want to make sure that it's safe for everyone because, again, getting back to that notion, more options, better choices, greater impact in stopping HIV, which is our business. So were we successful? Well, in some ways we were quite successful. We conducted rigorous and high quality science in support of topical delivery with our partners at Pop Council. And I'm very proud of the long association that we've had with you. And we've been able to do that with both vaginally and rectally applied products. And, you know, of course, one of the happiest days of my whole life was when we did get regulatory approval for the DapiRing ring and that it's being approved in several African countries. But what I see now as a danger to our entire endeavor is this continued obsession with finding the silver bullet, the thing that's going to solve everything. I hear when cabotegravir was coming along, and cabotegravir injectable long-acting is a wonderful product, wonderful, but it's not for everybody. Not everybody wants to have an injection every 2 months. Not everyone wants that idea of having systemic drug in your body. So I think what I'd like to remind everyone is that even though lenacapavir is very exciting subcutaneously, that's coming along, cabotegravir is there, there's still a lot of unmet need. And so we still have to identify safe, affordable, scalable products that women can choose to use to protect themselves. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for the chance to sharing at least a few of my reflections about my collaborations with all of you. And thank you very much for your collaborations with us.
Thank you so much, Sharon. That was fantastic. And we especially appreciate you sharing not just the history, but also the poetry as well. So much appreciated. Georgina, last but very much not least, we now turn it to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim. And it's really important that we're also recognizing the role of advocacy in getting the ring to where it is now. Advocacy has been key in creating a collective voice and platform for women's voices to be heard. And I remember I was a community engagement officer, and I was working with other migrants in the UK, and I was part of the global campaign for microbicides. This was about 15 years ago. And I also saw Laurie Heisey pop up on the webinar, and I see Manju Shatani Gada as well. on the webinar, and I'd just like to recognize them as advocates who really led us in calling for microbicides. We were women demanding a tool that is user-controlled so that we feel safe and so that we feel in control of our own health. Advocacy has been key in generating political will and subsequently financial investment for the science and the research, all those studies that Sharon just shared to actually happen. And advocacy by women users in the actual clinical trials has also shaped the product, the look, the feel, how it's packaged, what it's called, how it's delivered. So really without advocacy, we wouldn't be where we are now with the ring. And today there are also other critical roles that advocacy continues to play in moving the ring forward. Advocates are holding space for sexual and reproductive health and rights more broadly, and really doing so in the context of the rollback on women's rights, calling for the ring and for investment for the ring. We're the same people who are also trying to hold back the tide of regressive policies on women's rights. So those of us fighting the global gag rule and Roe versus Wade, we're also the ones pushing for more choices for women. But advocacy also reminds us to stay focused and to see things through, that we're in it for the long haul. And there are always new products and new ideas, and the ring has been around for a little while, but research is a long process and we need to stay with it. And there are a number of key advocacy platforms currently pushing for access to the ring and to other HIV prevention tools. We have the African Women HIV Prevention Community Advisory Board, which was recently formed at AIDS 2022. There's a regional platform of advocates called Africa Free of New HIV Infections, AFNI. We have Young and Bold AVAC fellows and community-led networks affiliated with AVAC, IPM, other agencies, just across the continent, speaking up for the ring in Global Fund, PEPFAR, UN, and other national decision-making spaces. There's a global HIV prevention coalition, which is providing countries with evidence and direction on HIV prevention. So in a world where the newest, sexiest thing is the one that catches people's attention, or the silver bullet, as Sharon called it, as advocates, we really help to maintain focus. We are not moving on and we remain persistent. And finally, advocacy remains key in pushing for access to the ring because it's a new product and it's unfamiliar to many. And we need the ring to be known and to be championed by real people. So this is what we call community mobilization. And for me, community mobilization and advocacy are very much linked. As I end, I would like to acknowledge and really honor the speakers and participants in today's webinar for your role in advocacy as well, because within each of the communities of scientists, researchers, funders, there are women's rights advocates. And there are some spaces and opportunities where we need different voices to prioritize the ring. Our advocacy in different ways and from different contexts have gotten us this far, and it's going to be our collective advocacy which will ensure that every woman who needs and wants the ring actually has access to it. So thank you again, but yes, just special thanks to all those who are there from the beginning and who really got us started in this work. We really like to honor you.
Thank you so much, Georgina, and particularly happy that for both Georgina and Diantha, the load shedding in South Africa allowed you to continue to participate and stay through the whole time. We now have a few minutes for questions from the audience, and so what you can do is type something in the chat, and I will try to direct the question as best I can to an individual or the group. But if people have questions, this is the opportunity to do so.
before there's other questions, I know there were a lot of people asking about the various papers and publications that were mentioned, and a lot of them are not available open access or online even. But we have hard copies of many of them, and so I'm going to see what I can do to make them available to people who participated in the webinar. So we'll stay tuned on that one.
Thank you, Barbara. We're getting a lot of congratulations for the excellent presentations, and not yet questions for people. Maybe Chris, since you have to leave in a moment, I could just ask, do you have any thoughts on, if you were to look 10 years or 20 years out, what you see is going to be? We've talked about history. How about the future? Anything that you think is going to happen or you would like to see happen at 10 years or 20 years out for now?
Well, I mean, I'm actually, like most people, much worse at predicting the future than remembering the past, and even the past is getting a little fuzzy these days. But I think I think Sharon made a very good point about how in HIV and across many other fields, we're often searching for the perfect and overlook the good in terms of, if you think about the success of HIV prevention, if you think about the success of many other public health interventions, it's a portfolio of all imperfect things, but put together and used by people, particularly if you get the information about what they want to use. I mean, Sharon's point about the ring, people choosing the ring, which might be less efficacious, compared to an oral PrEP daily. That's an article that's a point that Zena Stain made in the late 80s about how if we had, at the time there was speculation about whether any of the existing spermicides might be microbicidal and safe. And, in one of her papers in the late 80s, before we even, that I remember reading as we were beginning this, was, look, if it's on a per use basis, somewhat less effective, but people actually can use it, it might actually be much more important in terms of being a prevention technology. And I think we often are looking for the perfect to be, sometimes we forget about the good, and sometimes it takes a mix of good things to actually have an effective approach.
Thank you, Chris. Excellent point. We do have another question. This one I'll direct to Sharon, from Mitchell Warren, about what's the most important investment we could make today, irrespective of product.
Well, my own view is that we need to keep a laser focus on essentially investing in expanded options, because what we want are products that are so safe. They could be dispensed from behind the counter at a pharmacy, for example, not be medicalized. I would love to see a day, I said this a long time ago, my dream is to be able to walk into a pharmacy, or for a young woman to be able to walk into a pharmacy and pick up the product that's for her, that they're so safe. They don't have to go see a physician. They don't have to have a device, or if it is something that it's very long-term. So I think that with this, there's this tension, right, between perfect product with nearly perfect efficacy, but are expensive and require very expensive and difficult to come by, highly sensitive testing, versus something that may be 75 or 80% effective, but is so safe you could hand it out under the counter. So I actually think what we need to do is a really hard look at how we can bridge that product into people's hands. Part of this, which we haven't done in great, and that's not where I live. I live in getting clinical trials done and getting evidence, but I would love to see some real investment in how we make that transition. We know PrEP was very slow. We're seeing, a somewhat slow transition with cabotegravir, IM long acting. And I think the next stage of products, we really need to focus a lot better on how to get those out there. Without a doubt, the supply chains are broken too, right? There's family planning supply chains, and then there's ARV supply chains. And we have to figure out how to break down those silos so that products, the MPT products we're all working on so hard, can get into the hands of people, and we don't have these arguments of, I don't want to give someone an MPT because it might make them give up their implantable contraceptive. And you're like, we can't pit products against each other. We have to create a menu and let women choose what works for them, because that's how we're going to get the best choice.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I'm going to leave time for just one more question, and I'll direct it to Georgina. Georgina, since we've talked about the history and we've talked about the clinical work and so on, you've talked importantly about the advocacy community. And of course, you are in some ways, a lot of times, a connection to the end users of products. And I wonder if you could just share with us a little bit about what are you telling when you meet women now who say, boy, I need options, I need protection, I need something. What is the message that you're giving them right now when you talk to people?
Yeah, very good question. I think when I speak to people, and there are many, often if you speak to a young woman or you speak to someone in a serodiscordant relationship, as in line with what Sharon says, you need to be able to share the full package of what is available. The fact that condoms are available, male and female condoms, the fact that PrEP is available, the fact that there are other products that are actually on the horizon, and that we need to keep an eye out for them, and we need to be demanding them. And we shouldn't be shy to say, where is the ring? We heard that there is a ring out there. Where is the ring? But also for those in discordant relationships, being aware that you equals you. If you're undetectable, if your partner's undetectable, it's, you can support them to take their medication well, and therefore there will not be any transmission. So it's sharing the full package, but also making people aware that there's other tools out there. The injectable is also on the horizon. And if we don't demand for it, we will never actually get it. So Jim, sharing full information, holding nothing back, because what there is, and what there isn't, we must demand. Great.
Well, what an outstanding way to conclude, Georgina. Thank you so much. I want to thank all the presenters who have spoken and really taken us on an amazing history and analysis of our past, a little bit of a clarion call to the future. And I want to especially thank all the people who have been attending, many of whom are the giants of microbicide development, who have played such a huge role in getting us to the progress and the hope where we are today. So I'll just, on behalf of my council colleagues, Barbara and Diantha, Sherry, I just want to say thank you all for being here. This will be available on the Pop Council's YouTube channel, and we'll link to it from our website. And on behalf of the Pop Council, thank you all so very much for being here. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you so much, everybody.